Hello, everybody, and welcome to Proselytize or Apostatize, the show where we get Christians, atheists, and everything in between to discuss theology and different worldviews. Today, I'm your co-host, Caleb Jackson, and with me is my other co-host, James. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, man. It's good to be back. I think the last time I was on the show, I was debating you, Caleb. So it's not nice to be back with you.
You
And
were you
yeah, it's nice to have Swan and Aaron on the show today debating the relationship between God and morality. Welcome, Aaron and Swan. So, Aaron and Swan, why don't you just spend a minute introducing yourselves and tell us a little bit about your position today?
Aaron, I'll let you go first.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Erin Burnett. I'm a theology master's student from Northern Ireland in the UK. My position is that you can be good without God. Even though I am a Christian, albeit of a very liberal kind, I think in our globalized world where an awful lot of people are either not Christian or completely non-religious, we need to come up with some sort of alternative form of morality that will work for everyone, if that's even possible. So the gist of my position is religion can be useful, but it's not necessary in order to be a good person.
all right? Thank you, Aaron and Swan.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. So my name is Swan Sona. I'm a philosophy student at Kansas State University. I really enjoy studying, things like the metaphysics of God and ethics and political and social philosophy. And recently, I've been dabbling my toes in theology and scripture. And I have a podcast, YouTube channel, Facebook page called Intellectual Conservatism, where I discuss a lot of these issues. So, yeah, thank you for having me on. And hi, Aaron. It's good to finally talk to you.
All right, guys, great. So I think we decided in advance that we're going to try to do 10-minute openings, and then we're just going to try to have an open dialogue, and maybe James and I will help guide some of the questions depending on how it goes. But Swan, are you okay with going first since you're the affirmative? You're arguing that God is necessary for morality, and Aaron is the opposition. So we'll have the affirmative go first. You have around 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, then I'll time myself if that's okay. So 10 minutes.
That's
And if
yeah.
you want
Go
to keep
ahead.
track of me, that's fine too. Yeah.
It's not strict. You can. There's a little bit of leeway on the 10 minutes, but yeah,
All
whenever you're
right.
ready.
All right. Well, yeah, I want to begin by just thanking Apostatize or Proselytize for inviting me on to talk again about a very important subject. Probably one of my favorite subjects actually to study and think about, which is the relationship between God and morality. And this is the first time I've ever really had a discussion with a Christian agnostic about this particular subject. So, I'm not really interested in kind of coming here and giving a, proofs and, having a very dry philosophical debate. Because I think Aaron and I might agree on actually a lot of things in terms of the relationship between God and morality in the public sphere. These are very useful and valuable questions. So I just want to begin by opening with that kind of acknowledgement of what my goals are. So I want to begin by just talking about then the importance of morality itself. So all of us acknowledge, or all of us have recognized that there's something important about when someone claims they have a natural right to something, or when they have rights that transcend the government, the institutions of law, when they have rights that stand against those who are in power. So, for instance, take when you have individuals who are minorities in a society, individuals who don't have the power or are structurally disadvantaged, they can appeal to something deeper, more ancient and fundamental than the state itself. They can appeal to the moral law itself. And that's why it matters, I think, that when we discuss morality, we acknowledge that institutions do play a role in shaping the moral consciousness of a society, but also that consciousness, that political sphere, has to be shaped by something deeper and more fundamental in order to protect something deeper, which is our natural rights, those things that are deeper than political society itself. This leads me then to the second observation, which is that there's a problem, I think, when we try to understand morality in terms of purely evolutionary or psychological factors. There's a tendency sometimes, if one rejects a religious explanation for the grounding of morality, to appeal to something like our common, maybe aversion towards pain, or even perhaps other various evolutionary dynamics on how groups are formed, on how structures and hierarchies are made, and so on and so forth. And I think the problem with this is that one, we understand from, for instance, the economic sciences or cognitive science, that human beings pursue rational self-interest. But then there's a problem. Because for instance, as the philosopher David Berlinski explains, suppose that there's this button in front of you that you can press. And this button is such that if you were to press it, then, one person in China, let's say a villager dies. But then you discipline to refrain from pressing that button. Now, the difficulty here is that if human beings are motivated by only rational self-interest, then why not press the button? Only one life is lost, and this life is one that you'll never encounter. And perhaps as a mere Chinese peasant, this life didn't really matter much to the grand scheme of the economic or social apparatus of that society. But also, there's a problem when we try to base human equality on, let's say, a common feature like consciousness. So Jeff McMahon wrote a paper not too long ago titled, I believe it's something like, something about the origins or roots of the liberal egalitarian human view of the value of the human person, right? So the liberal egalitarian view says that human beings are superior to animals, they yet moral equals to one another. And McMahon says, well, if you say that the reason why human beings are different is because we have consciousness, well, what about persons that are disabled to some extent? Or if we say that human beings have a different degree of consciousness that makes us unique, then wouldn't it then be the case that those who are more fully developed would have more rights or more importance, right? So then the disabled would seem to not have as much of a say in our society. So McMahon actually believes that our liberal egalitarian views on human equality actually rest on distressingly insecure foundations. If we are simply basing morality on some evolutionary or psychological explanation, then we see that we get the explanation for our moral sentiments, as Adam Smith would say, but we don't get the synthesis about how we ought to structure those sentiments, what passions or aversions towards pain, what kinds of harms are morally significant. We require philosophy to ultimately help us to understand the total structure of our moral system. So that's why I want to emphasize in my third point that there seems to be an inevitability of philosophy. So it doesn't matter, right? If we want to say that, okay, let's think about what socially is most advantageous for the group, or what should we believe? Rather, we recognize that at some point we're going to have to get down to the philosophical bedrock of what we believe, because it really does matter if there is such a thing as an intention foresight distinction. If there really is a significant causal distinction between killing and letting die. Right, so philosophy inevitably has to come into the question in order for us to understand the very subject that we are talking about. Because, for instance, McMahon says, after saying that our views on human equality are distressingly insecure, he says, but maybe we should just believe it because we think it's a good thing to believe. But that doesn't really compel us. And at any moment, if someone points out that the emperor has no clothes, then that system falls apart. So I want to offer then kind of my approach to how I view morality. So I view morality as the science of how to fulfill one's nature. And the reason why I'm a theist, based on this kind of moral backdrop, is because I think that morality actually presupposes 5 important principles that each collectively together point to the existence of God. So for instance, there's such a thing as the convertibility principle, where being and goodness are interchangeable. This is to say that the fulfillment of something is what we mean by goodness. There's the fact that then we need to talk about the essence of something. So the thesis of real essentialism. And then finally, we recognize that, cause and effects aren't arbitrary, but causes are intrinsically ordered or tending towards their effects. So to use an example from Edward Fazer, or even David Otterberg, they use the example of suppose that you see a triangle, etched into maybe a car or, on a bus or on a tree. And then you say, that's a good triangle. What you're saying is this particular instantiation of triangle is tending towards or aiming towards the fullness of being of what a triangle is supposed to be. So then we see the essence of the triangle is invoked in order to be kind of the proper referent for what a particular triangle is supposed to be. We see that the more fully that thing is as it's supposed to be, it has more goodness. And then we also see that we can tell that there's intentionality behind the act of drawing the triangle, that the person who was drawing the triangle was really intending or aiming towards instantiating a triangle. And of course, we can go into other examples, such as from the great philosopher Philippa Foot, on how really morality depends upon an idea of harm. And you can't have an idea of harm without proper function in the background. Or even someone like the late philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson, she acknowledges in her account of morality, even though she's not a natural law theorist, she's a Kantian or deontologist, she says, yeah, we need to have some talk of design function in order to just get our foot off onto the project of morality. Then we can talk about the principle of sufficient reason, which says that there's a sufficient explanation for why some contingent reality obtains. This is to say why some reality that otherwise need not have obtained does in fact obtain in the real world. Because the PSR helps us look at human action and see that it's reason-driven. There is a sufficient explanation or reason for why I perform some action. And my actions are aiming towards the good. Even if I fail to attain the good, nonetheless, I can understand it as a failure because it was tending towards some object. And we can discern these objects in our understanding of morality. And then finally, we can talk about the principle of proportionate causality, which simply completes our theory of explanation or causation. Because whenever a cause produces some effect, whatever perfections or realities are in the effect, they had to somehow pre-exist in the cause. So it's not the case that something causes another thing, it just came out ex nihilo, right? There was something from which the effect was drawing from in the cause. Now, that doesn't mean that the effect exists exactly as it does in the real world as it does in the cause, right? There are different distinctions we can have, but the point here is that being produces being, and that whenever we see a cause produce an effect, it's not non-being producing being. There's a continuation of reality there. Now, of course, I don't have enough time to explain how exactly this creates a moral system, but I think the gist is explained. And I also think that once you look at certain arguments like the principle of sufficient reason and how they can point to the existence of God from arguments like contingency or Preston Kuhn's argument on the PSR leading to a simple unbounded supreme being. And we can get into other arguments such as the principle of proportionate causality dealing with the gap problem. How do you get from the first cause to a personal agent, so to speak? But the point I want to make then is that if morality is the science of how to fulfill one's nature, and these natural laws or principles are available to all human beings, then we can engage in a moral society with these natural laws in mind, with this public knowledge. But I think we have to acknowledge, and there goes my timer, that eventually the ultimate good we are aiming for is God himself, the one who created the moral law, the one who is the fulfillment of our nature. And hence, to remove God from the moral sphere is to remove, in some sense, our own fulfillment and happiness. And that's where I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you so much, Swan. As a side note, I know David can hear it. Did any of you all hear a clicking noise? I wasn't sure if that was from Swan's microphone or if it's just
I can hear like a rattling sound.
Yeah. That's what I was talking about. Does your phone or does your timer, Swan, have, if it's really close to your mic, I don't know if it's doing that or if it was your timer or something, but I don't hear it anymore, so.
Oh,
I don't
it's
know if it's
probably
just
my ring. Yeah, my ring is kind of like has two pieces on it. So let me take it off then maybe.
Oh, okay. I didn't think
Yeah.
that. Oh, yeah, I just heard it when you put it down. Yeah, I think that's what it was.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. All right, Aaron, you get about 10 minutes as well. Start when you're ready.
Okay, well, first of all, like Swan said, I think we're going to agree with a lot of things, so maybe this isn't going to be a fun debate because we're not going to be at each other's throats. But so as I said in my introduction, I would consider myself to be an agnostic Christian, and I am well aware of how contradictory that seems. So I go to church, I have a theology degree, I try my best to follow the way of Christ, but at the end of the day, if I am brutally honest with myself, I simply can never know for sure if any of the supernatural elements of the faith are true or not. So therefore, I will look at the issue of morality from the perspective of a very liberal Christian. And also, I feel like I should give an advance warning because I use some specific examples, and if kids are watching, it involves adult examples. So my conversation partner is extremely intelligent. He uses very philosophical arguments, and I think the difference between our perspectives is that I'm a big fan of practical theology and just practical ethics in general. And to use the fancy terminology, I would prefer a consequentialist form of morality rather than, say, a natural law or deontological form. So, to be blunt, I really don't care where morality originates from. I care much more about how our actions impact upon other people in the here and now. So, my view on morality is partially inspired by this book called Godless Morality, which was written by Richard Holloway, and he was the Bishop of Edinburgh at the time, so a very senior churchman. But he argued that in our modern world, we need to discover and promote a genuinely ecumenical ethic that will appeal to both religious and non-religious people. And this is particularly the case in the UK, where he was writing, because we are now approaching 50% of the population being non-religious. So the church simply doesn't have the moral monopoly that it once had. Holloway is a fan of John Stuart Mill, whose harm principle is arguably the best and most simple way to do ethics. He states that we should be free to do whatever we want as long as it does not cause harm. Of course, then we have to agree on what exactly harm is. And I would say that harm is simply anything that interferes with human or animal flourishing. And I'm sure Swan would probably agree with me on this, although he would, of course, argue that human flourishing comes from following God's intentions through natural law, whereas I think it's probably more likely that it's just the result of an evolutionary process. We have evolved to be a deeply empathetic species, and it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that all humans can flourish. It's for the overall good of the species. It would also explain why morality continues to develop over time, why we now consider certain things to be immoral, even though even one generation before it was perfectly fine. And of course, it is possible that God was the one who was behind all this evolution. And I mean, I'm open to that possibility. If you wanted to bring God into it, I suppose this form of morality would fit with the idea of progressive revelation, that God is gradually revealing his truth over time in a way that is appropriate to the context. But you do not have to be a theist in order to apply the harm principle. And that's what's so great about it. It really is universal. Now, Swan brought up the very good point about disability rights, and that is definitely a critique of the evolutionary view. And to that point, I would say the highest evolved species, so apes and humans, show signs of empathy, of looking after the injured instead of just abandoning them as lower forms of animals do. So I think even just using our basic empathy, we can still care for those who are perhaps not quite as rational. Now, we should probably look at the Bible in particular if we're talking about ethics and God, and particularly Christianity. I don't think that biblically based ethics are sufficient for the modern world. It's certainly a good starting point, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And of course, it's interesting that my opponent is a Catholic. This would perhaps be more contentious if I was debating, say, a sola scriptura or a Protestant. Now, Deuteronomy 22 is one of the many examples why so-called biblical morality cannot come from an omnipotent deity. Rather, it comes from humans who are trying to discern the will of God and not quite getting there. So I apologize in advance for the graphicness of this example, but it's in the Bible. So Deuteronomy 22 says that a woman can be stoned for not being a virgin on her wedding night. Okay. But in order to prove that she is a virgin, she must be able to produce sheets stained with blood from the wedding night. We now understand that this so-called virginity test is biologically inaccurate. Not all women bleed for the first time. Some don't even have a hymen. Therefore, this law would allow for perfectly innocent women to be stoned to death. And that does not sound like the work of a loving God to me. And I know that many would respond to this with, but that's the Old Testament. Things are different now. And yes, that's true. But the point is, biologically inaccurate laws such as these cannot come from an omnipotent God. They are clearly the creation of flawed humans, influenced by their time and culture. This is why we need to detangle the concept of morality from religion. Now, where does Jesus fit into all this? As a liberal Christian, I still believe that the way of Jesus is a pretty good way for someone to live their life. In fact, there are even Christian atheists out there who have wholeheartedly rejected the doctrines of Christianity while still following the ethical teachings of Jesus. So, for example, secular humanist Julian Baggini recently published a book about how the teachings of Jesus can transcend religious divides. He writes that at the heart of Jesus' teaching is the need to have goodwill to all. It's not about a long list of do's and don'ts. It is a challenge to respond with love to the specific needs of every individual situation. He is impressed by Jesus' care for the poor, outcasts, the powerless, his emphasis on forgiveness, compassion, humility. All of these things are virtues that can be embraced by Christians and atheists alike. So, to conclude, I shall briefly recap my 3 core arguments. 1, you do not need God to be a moral person. Following religious teaching can certainly help, but it's not necessary. 2, evolutionary biology can account for our developing sense of right and wrong. And 3, the harm principle is a simple way to evaluate morality, and it's a principle that everyone can use. And that is my argument.
All right, thank you, guys. James, do you want to say something? I know you haven't start them off on their discussion.
Yeah, sure. I think I just wanted to comment on what you said, Aaron. That you would tend to agree a lot with Swan's position. However, I see your positions as being very different. You seem to ground your position in something that is practical and real and tangible. And Swan, you appeal to philosophy and something that is seems to be abstract. I wanted to just follow up on where you left off, Swan, because you were fairly limited in time. I think you did well pointing out the problems within contemporary moral debate, or the problems that we face in this particular moral debate and have faced through the centuries. But you said I can't exactly describe. You said I can't exactly describe how this creates a moral system. I think it would be helpful for the debate and for our viewers for you to describe your moral system based on your position. So I will leave that there with you. What about you, Caleb? Did you have any comments on or observations you'd like to bring to light?
Yeah, but I'll let Swan address what you said first. I'll give him a chance. So I think what we can do is we can we can ask them questions from their opening statements to the other person to clarify, and then just kind of see where that goes. So I'll let Swan go ahead and respond to what James asked about Aaron's comment earlier. You're muted, by the way. I think David muted you because you're clicking sound.
Okay, am I back?
Yep.
Okay, so we get a system of morality from these 5 principles because for instance, when we observe natural laws in operation in the natural world, we see that nature has certain tendencies, and that these tendencies can also lead to predictable outcomes. So, for instance, I observe that if I drop, right, maybe some kind of object, it falls at a certain velocity, and therefore I can predict in the future what kinds of things will happen if I drop similarly weighted objects or with the same kind of mass, right? So then, in the same sense, then the natural law theorist is going to look at nature and study the nature of particular organisms or creatures and see what do they tend towards in order to sustain themselves, in order to pursue the good, right? So, for instance, we see that for a human being, our biological tendency, one of them, the most fundamental, is to stay alive, right? So our bodies will react in certain ways in order to stay alive. We'll see that, for instance, to deprive someone of, let's say, a properly functioning organ, even, and there's no reason, let's say, to deprive them of it, like their hand, to cut their hand off, right? There's something there that violates what ought to be there, what is part of the nature of that human person, right? So then what happens is then we begin to study, okay, what fulfills human nature? And we develop this list of things that are called basic goods. So if you want to read more about this, you can look at the work of David Otterberg in his paper, I believe it's The Structure and Content of the Good, in which we explore what explains human action. Why do human beings pursue certain things, right? So for instance, I'm pursuing right now the good of knowledge by interacting with everyone. I'm trying to pursue the truth, and that's what explains my actions of providing arguments, of assessing what Aaron's saying, of writing down my notes. I'm pursuing the good of friendship, right? Because I don't want to yell at Aaron. I don't want to make anyone feel bad, right? So there's an intrinsic goodness or value of friendship, and that motivates me. That, in some sense, metaphysically explains why I'm drawn towards certain actions. And then virtues would be understood as those things that predispose us towards or dispose us towards the goods in question. So there's a lot that's going on there. But I just want to say that if human action is reason driven, then we need to ask ourselves, why did we think that the action was worth performing? Why was the action reasonable to us such that it was worth enacting in the first place? And when we use this language of like what makes it worth doing, we're really just talking about the good that we're pursuing in the process. So then in the process, you can create different principles. You can analyze, well, if human beings all have the same nature, how can you discriminate between them, right? If the nature is what explains our properties, and uh, you know, and the nature is shared by all the same members, then how could you legitimately discriminate between them, right? So, for instance, maybe one person is more eloquent or more intelligent than the other, maybe a more productive member of society in some economic sense. Then you could say, well, but if we're all human beings, and what makes us valuable is the fact that, as the convertibility principle states, that being and goodness are convertible, then the fact that that person exists is good. There's a value in that human life intrinsically. And if we have the same nature, and the nature is what grounds morality, then we're under the same moral law, we're under the same principles. You can't just discriminate on the basis of some outcome when, for instance, the natural law position is not necessarily concerned with outcomes. It's concerned with flourishing, certainly, but it's also concerned with the integrity of human actions, with the integrity of virtue, and so on and so forth. So that's just a very kind of general explanation of how you get a moral system from these 5 principles.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Swan. So I'm going to give Aaron a chance to respond to that in just a second. But I would like to also ask a question or clarify on her position. So I think you talked about flourishing a lot, right, Aaron, and the harm principle and stuff like that. But I always imagine, and I don't have kids yet, but little kids like to ask the question why to a lot of things, right? So I can imagine someone asking, well, why is harm bad? And I think eventually it seems that when you get to it, it's just, well, that's what we ultimately want, right? So my question to you, Aaron, is that do you think morality is ultimately emotivism? Is that if we act as if it's true because we want it to be the truth? We want it to be the case that human life has value and that pain is bad, and so we live as if that is. Um, so if you'd like to address that, if you understood what I was saying.
Yes, I suppose it depends how nihilistic you want to be. I suppose those on like the real atheist end of the spectrum would say there is no why, It just is. But I would perhaps say that question, why is harm bad? Well, we just know experientially that it is. The vast majority of people, unless you have some sort of severe neurological disorder, feel pain and don't like it. It really is that simple. Sorry, I don't have quite as eloquent answers as Swan does. But pain is bad. We just instinctively know pain is bad, and therefore we try and avoid it.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. All right, before we open up the conversation, I'll just get a couple more clarifications. Swan, so Erin brought up in her opening statement about she didn't use the word atrocities, but like outdated biological arguments. She talked about the stoning before marriage because of premarital sex or whatever. And I'm sure that we could all point to accounts we've heard where God orders people to get slain in what at least appears to be a genocide. So I guess my question to you, Swan, is the Bible outdated in certain elements regarding morality? And if it's true, as you say, that humans have intrinsic value, does God not himself violate that value whenever he allows someone to get a disease or get murdered and so forth? So I'll let you address that.
Yeah, there's a lot of I think worthwhile things that Aaron pointed out. And the thing is, like, it depends on, how deeply I want to go into Christianity, right? Because I could just appeal to a transcendent good creator, and that's all that I really need to say, perhaps, right? Human beings should believe in the transcendent. We should believe that the good is everlasting and real, and that, you know, the creator of the world, who created the moral law, who gave us our natures, who is, the fount of existence and the supreme reality. That reality we see created us with certain ends, wants us to pursue the good. And then we see that if this being is the fullness of existence and reality, then by the convertibility principle, this being would be the highest good, right? Because it would be the source of everything else. It would be the structure of what makes morality intelligible, ultimately speaking. So then it would be the highest intellectual good. This creature would, this creator would be the highest intellectual good, the greatest beauty that we can ever imagine. It explains everything else in the world. So I could just appeal to that kind of transcendent creator and just say, yeah, okay, the Bible, biblical example, sure, but we need to believe in the transcendent. Maybe that's what I could say. And even, certain Christian atheists like Douglas Murray or even Don Cupid will talk about how, it's a real tragedy that we've lost a sense of the transcendent and something that is beyond us, so to speak. And I think even individuals like the late philosopher Sir Roger Scruton have talked about how we need the face of God still, in some way or another. We need to still see another human being as, in some sense, carrying the divine in them, as carrying something infinite and beautiful. And that this can't just be some nice piece of poetry that we say to one another, right? There has to be something real about it, which is why, it goes back to my first point about why it's significant that, natural rights aren't just fictions, but they are real and stand against the institutions of power, stand against those who are structurally advantaged, so to speak. So to get to the biblical example then, I mean, it depends on how you approach the hermeneutics, and I'm sure Aaron is familiar with how maybe some people have interpreted these particular passages. So if you take a more fundamentalist perspective and you say God literally wrote these things, then I'm sure, like, specifically the thought, which is the 630 laws of the Old Testament, you'll probably run into problems, right? Trying to make sense of, there's a clear biological problem here or error. So I think the approach that I would take is kind of like a critical realist one. So I'd say, okay, I understand that there is some culture and some of the the science and the understanding of the times that are appearing in the text. But even historically speaking, when we look at how the Torah was actually applied, the rabbis and the scribes and the oral Torah were how they really manifested and implemented the law. So of course there were times where they did stone people because maybe they betrayed Israel or they committed treason, and so then that gets down to what you think about the death penalty, right? But it was not just a simple petty act that got them killed or a biological error, right? So then, yeah, there have to be some nuance there in our historical interpretation, but also like, there's, as classical theists, as someone from a Thomistic background or kind of from a more ancient school of philosophy, there's this belief that God is not a moral agent like everybody else. God is in some sense above the moral law, because if morality is predicated on our nature and the science of fulfilling our nature, then God wouldn't technically be bound by human law since he's not a human being, right? So God could technically do things that other beings could not be allowed to do. And I believe that Aaron is, I don't want to make assumptions, but Aaron might be a vegan or vegetarian, right? So you believe in the rights of even animals or their potential equality with humans. Whereas I would just say ontologically, there's a radical difference between us. And then I just apply the same logic to God and say ontologically, because God is a higher being than us, the moral law would be kind of different. The moral law, so to speak, would be kind of different for him.
All right. If James is okay with it, I think we can go ahead and go to a just a conversation between the two. So at this point, we won't be guiding as much unless we feel it's needed. So we'll just kind of have them talk back and forth. To start off the conversation, I was going to bring up a point that Aaron brought up earlier that I don't think Swan has yet addressed, which is the idea that she mentions how our morality develops over time and how things we thought were, we could take slavery or 100 other examples that we thought were moral 150, 200 years ago, now we think are immoral. So we can start off the conversation on this and kind of see where it goes. But so I guess for the theist, Swan, why should we believe objective morality or that virtue exists at all, instead of it just being something that we kind of make up over time and that evolves? So you all can both unmute yourselves and have at it, and we'll see where it goes. And as a side note, Swan, you don't have the rattling now, but there was one earlier. So I don't know if it's your mic or what it is, but it comes and goes. So I don't know why it happens.
Was it in my most recent response, the rattling sound, or was it not there?
No, it was there.
Yeah, well, I maybe I should put the microphone further away from me or something. I don't know.
Let's see what that does. Okay.
All right, yeah, sure. So, yeah, I guess I'll address the 2 points, and then I'll let Erin kind of dive in with whatever question she has. So, oh, okay, it wasn't in my last response. That's what David Russell said. So, okay, I'll put the microphone back close to me. Okay, we'll see. Okay, yeah, I took off my necklace, I took off my jewelry, I moved my phone, so I hope that fixes everything. Yeah, let's see here. There we go. Okay, so I mean, philosophers like William Lane Craig have explained that even the concept of a development or progress in morality presupposes that we are tending towards some better state, right? So that means that we're making progress, right? So we're moving up to some kind of ideal that we are finally attaining. And I think that then you inherently have a teleological underpinning to that very idea. You already have an idea of like there's a reality to morality that it's not just a social ideal, right? But there's something deeper there. Although I think Aaron might appeal, or one could appeal to then like evolutionary explanations for morality, such as our common empathy. And in my opening statement, in my second point, I did talk about how first, evolution also tells us that human beings are governed by a rational self-interest, which is basically what underpins all of economics, and that there's a danger sometimes where economics becomes our morality, right? So that the least productive members of society aren't viewed as valuable, or we're just seeking getting the best outcomes at the expense of individual rights, or even what the minorities in the society have to say. And then even talk about too, like how human equality on an evolutionary perspective does face some difficulties, especially if Peter Singer and Jeff McMahon are probably, I would say, the practical ethicists. Singer literally wrote the book Practical Ethics, where he argues that infants a few months after they're born don't have many moral value, right? Because they aren't self-aware, and self-awareness doesn't occur until I think about like 8 months or so after a child is born. So during that time, they're free game, basically, so to speak. Their value is only contingent on if someone wants them. So I don't think evolution provides a complete explanation. It does certainly explain group formation. It's relevant in many other ways. But I actually said in my opening statement in the second part, that evolution explains the sentiments of morality, but it doesn't explain how to synthesize them. So we have these feelings, we have these emotions, we have these drives, but how do we order them such that we end up with a rational system that is internally consistent and not subject to passing by the whims of power? And that's all I have to say on that.
Okay. First of all, I think I should just point out that you mentioned two of possibly my favorite writers ever, which was Douglas Murray and Don Cupid. But that's besides the point. So let's see, which point should I tackle first? I suppose I'll tackle the bit about evolutionary biology and morality and all that. I would agree with you. Yes, we are governed by instinct. However, and I do agree that self-fulfillment is a very strong instinct. However, it's not the only one. There's plenty of other, like the caring instinct, maternal instinct, particularly. These are other instincts which then drive us towards caring for people who are the weaker in society. And as for how do we then systematize these, what are little more than biological urges, how do we put this into a code of conduct? Well, I would say human civilization has been gradually honing our code of conduct for millennia, starting with ancient laws like the ones we mentioned in the Bible, the 600 and something laws, and we keep developing them. Every society has its own laws, which are continuously debated and repealed or added to as we develop our sense of what's right and wrong. So I suppose that's where the state comes in. So to answer your question, how do we systematize these things? I would say, well, that is where either religious laws or the state comes in. But these rules are not infallible and they must always be open for debate and challenge. What else to say? I might just add, this is sort of taking the conversation off in another direction, but you were talking about how unless we have classical theism, that there is, the classical theist, God gives meaning to why we have this sense of morality. There are other ways of looking at God. For example, you mentioned Don Cupid, who was, of course, a Church of England priest. But he argued that instead of God being some sort of supernatural being out there, God is simply the personification, like an anthropomorphized version of the values we wish to promote. So God isn't really a being at all, it's just a grand metaphor. And of course, that's just his personal opinion, but I suppose it just proves that even within Christendom, there is a vast disagreement on what God actually is. And finally, before I shut up, the point about God essentially not having to follow his own rules, well, surely that's what a despot does, or like a political dictator makes the rules. It's one rule for thee, but not for me. We even see this now when politicians are making coronavirus rules and then breaking them, and it's very annoying. So I would perhaps say that makes God a wee bit of a hypocrite. And that is my point.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I guess the first thing that I'd want to talk about then is just, yeah. I mean, so human beings have this capacity for empathy, right? And we have this capacity for recognizing our own and for caring for others, right? But we also see that sometimes us human beings, we're very selective about when we show care, about when we show empathy. So for instance, you could take the acts of, for instance, the Nazis, right? So there'll be stories about how these Nazi generals in Auschwitz and these other camps, they would do incredibly cruel things without even flinching, and then when they'd go home, they'd hug their children and kiss them goodnight. And there's this eeriness to it, right? About how, yeah, this other human being has empathy, but they clearly believed, right, that this empathy was selective. So I think the question that I have here then is what gives empathy, so to speak, its hotness, its compellingness, and how do we delineate the scope of our empathy, right? So there's a question there about why I'm saying that I think evolution gives us the sentiments, so it explains why us as biological creatures, right, have the sentiments that we do. It doesn't get at the bedrock of really why we ought to obey this empathy, or even how we ought to apply this empathy in cases rather than other cases, so to speak. And then just to hit then on the point on God not following his own rules, right? So the thing is, like, so as a classical theist, I don't believe that God is a person. I don't believe that God is analogous to a human being. So we can approach God with our human concepts and ideas, but fundamentally speaking, you know, the foundation of all existence is not going to be like any created thing, or else it would just be another part of the creation. And then also, I'm sure you reject kind of like a hierarchical view of ethics, where if you have ontological perfections that another group doesn't have. So, for instance, human beings radically in their being have this capacity for rationality. Animals, they can reason to some extent, but the capacity to, for instance, comprehend universals or the transcendentals, that seems to be lacking in animals, and then so on and so forth. So then I would just say that I can offer a principled distinction for why God would not be bound by human law, because I don't presuppose that God is a human being or a person analogous to us, and I already have a hierarchical view on the ontological structure of ethics. So that's just a lot of big words, and I'm sure they're not satisfying, right? But Aaron, you tell me, what you think about that.
Well, first of all, I agree that if the God of classical theism does exist, then he would be beyond this creation. However, I'm just not sure that the God of classical theism does exist, which means that I need to find some sort of ethical system that I can use regardless of my disbelief. On the point about humans being very selective on what instincts we follow, yes, I agree with you. Humans are awful. We have the capacity to be really, really awful. Group instinct, like the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, humans will do awful things if someone in authority tells them to do it. That is why bodies like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course was drafted after the World War II atrocities, are really important, because it gives us something to fall back on. No matter what the dude in power says, we have these rights, which I would say are derived from our better instincts. See, I could go on with another example, but do either of the moderators want to add anything?
I don't know if James has anything to add. I was going to ask for a clarification on one of Swan's points. By the way, I think he muted you, Swan, because your thing was going off really loud again. I don't know what it is, so we'll just ignore it. But so you all, both of you were talking about the God not having to follow his own rules, and then Swan appealed to classical theism and that God's not a person; he's absolute being. Um, and I noticed that he, I think it was in his opening or sometime, used the analogy of teleology a lot, right? Of designing value and virtue in people, if I'm representing that correctly. So I guess my clarification question for Swan is, if morality is like within God's design of the universe, I can imagine God designing a zebra without stripes, or I can imagine God making Earth have 5 moons instead of one. So I guess the question is God's design arbitrary in that sense? And is there a possible world he could have made where humans don't have, where people don't have value, or where murder was okay, etc.? So the question is God's teleology of the universe arbitrary when it comes to morality and moral values?
Right. So, I mean, so the thrust of the argument seems to be that, if I say that I'm appealing to teleology for morality, right, and I'm saying that this gives us the moral law, but then God can kind of do other things, can do things that other beings aren't allowed to do, right? Then that seems to just kind of make the teleology insignificant or disappear in a sense. Like, oh, it was significant here, but now it's not significant there. I think my response would be to point out that God, under the natural law view, religion is considered one of the basic goods in natural law theory. So usually there's 7 basic goods, and I can go into that list later. But the idea here is that if God exists, and God is the end all be all of what we are made for, right? So for instance, in natural law theory, life is the greatest basic good. So there's a hierarchy of the good. The reason why life is the greatest basic good and why you can't violate it, unless you have some proportionate good that you're pursuing, but then that gets into double effect. But the reason why the life is the greatest basic good is because it's the most fundamental one, and that you cannot pursue the good unless you are first alive, right? And that's why we would even say, for instance, on the debate on euthanasia, right? Like, you're not better off if you're dead, because once you're dead, there is nothing good for you to even attain, right? Because you're taken out of existence, right? So being is lost. Excuse me. So then, if we take this hierarchical view of the good, then if God is the greatest good, if God is the good itself, if God is the source of all perfection and goodness, then His dictates and His desires would be the greatest of all the goods that we could pursue. So then, in that sense, then even our life would be subordinate to God, because God would be, in some sense, the one who grounds us and the one who gives us everything, to the point where it's not the case that I even, so to speak, own myself and I'm autonomous with respect to other human beings, right? Because other human beings, we share the same nature, we share the same moral properties, right? But no other human being is the greatest possible good, even beyond my own life, except for God. So that therefore you could intelligibly make a distinction without violating the teleological structure of the world.
Okay. So I guess as far as I understood it, so there's no possible way that God could not be the greatest end all be all, and so it just wouldn't be metaphysically possible to have a different essence of good besides God.
Yeah, and then also because, for instance, like the convertibility principle says that being and goodness are convertible or interchangeable, then anything that exists, insofar as exists or has the reality or fullness of existence, is good, right? That's valuable there. So then, if God creates a human being, it's not possible for Him to create a human being without value, because the mere fact that that human being exists is in itself valuable, and it's the greatest basic good, life itself. That's how precious one human life is.
Gotcha. James, do you have anything to comment on before we carry on the conversation?
Yeah, I just I'm a little bit blunt in how I portray things, but I would say that that's um just in response to one is fairly philosophical, because you point to a creator and basically essentially you're saying if that creator who lives eternally and um eternally is, and that's an essence of good, is, and then creates human beings, and that is good, then God is ultimately the essence of all goodness, or the highest point of what goodness can be. Um, I think a problem I'm seeing in like the philosophy of ethics is to, I guess, in some ways reiterate Aaron's position. It's not really grounded in reality, and also the question that we're debating here today, which is the relationship between God and morality. And when you look at who God actually is and who God has revealed Himself to be, we come back to the question of or the position of Aaron, which is fairly grounded, that biblically based ethics are not sufficient, and they must be detangled from the concept of morality, the concept of morality, or from the Bible. It must be detangled from the Bible. So I'd wonder, I mean, because God is in some sense seen to be immoral through, like, for example, the example that Aaron presented earlier. So if God is seen to be immoral in that sense, and there's clear examples of God's immorality, then how is a abstract or philosophical concept of God, which is somewhat removed from the evidence that we have from God, a plausible argument or a sufficient
Yeah, I
argument?
mean, so it depends on how two things, right? I think it depends on how practical you want to make ethics then. Because if you make ethics so practical that it basically becomes a branch of economics, then you're going to run into a ton of problems, right? So if you're going to be concerned about the long run of a human civilization, then you might actually seriously consider whether or not the disabled are worth depleting the resources of the gene pool, right? If you want to go that practical in ethics, then you can, or but you shouldn't, I think the second thing too is to point out that my third point in my opening statement was that there is the inevitability of philosophy. So inevitably speaking, you're going to have to get into things like the intention foresight distinction. You're going to have to distinguish, okay, what counts as me causing someone to die, as opposed me merely letting them die, right? So I think that what I would say is there's an underappreciation of the importance of philosophy in even the practical pursuit of things. And I think that when you become so practical that you take for granted your philosophical beliefs or underpinnings, then this ends up depriving you of really what you want, which is the force of reason itself. Right? Because you want something that you can appeal to that is not even subject to the powers and principalities, so to speak, of human beings. So, for instance, Aaron mentioned the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So, what we did was we appealed to one human institution to deal with another human institution. So we said we're going to give more power to this human institution to deal with this human institution. So then the fundamental principle then seems to be power. But then power doesn't always follow goodness, so to speak, right? So goodness, I mean, power could be found in an institution that is immoral and under the dictates of a dictator, right? Or something like that, so to speak. So I think, those are some things to keep in mind. And I guess, let me see if there's any, excuse me. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say. Oh, one last thing, I guess. So I think that, I think a lot of people have recognized that, going all the way back to like even Plato's dialogues. So, you guys said I'm too abstract. Well, guess what? I'm going back to Plato. So I don't know if I'm helping my own cause, right? But, there were tons of conversations in the Republic about why should you be virtuous? Why should you be a good person? Right. And I used the example in the beginning of David Berlinski and, that button that you can press and it could kill just a villager in China, but you get everything that you ever wanted. Like, but why not, pursue your rational self-interest or even, the ring of Gyges. You put the ring on and you can escape all accountability and you can do basically whatever you want and no one ever is ever going to attack you, right? Some people would say, well, justice is just the will of the more powerful. And that was Thrasymachus's position. Someone might say that what is good is simply, whatever most benefits your rational self-interest, right? Or even the harm principle, right? Whatever interferes with human and animal flourishing, or I think Mill even adds in, consent to that, right? So if you harm an unconsenting third party. So then the question is then, what is harm? And then Philippa Foot, who's written a paper on this titled Moral Beliefs, she talks about how the idea of harm presupposes teleology, and then she has to appeal to Aristotelian metaphysics to explain, right, what makes sense of the fact that there is such a thing as proper function. And it's not just a fiction. It's not just something that we stamp down with our foot or with power, but it's something that stands independent of us, that's older and more ancient and fundamental than the state. So, that's one thing I'd point out. And then the last thing, promise you this. The early Christians, they when they saw something good, when they saw something beautiful, the early Christians, they understood that that was literally, in some sense, the divine being manifested in the material world. So that's why you have like a sacramental view of nature, where nature can actually manifest the grace of God. They didn't view the material world as just a bunch of stuff. They viewed it as something flowing with the divine reality. And that's why they could even say that that small deformed child that's been left behind by his parents in Rome on the side of the road to die, why even that beautiful child has value because they could see the element of the divine in that child. So I think that depriving us of the divine is depriving us of too much. It's depriving us of more than we realize. And I think that once we look underneath our practicality and into the philosophical roots, we'll see that the price we're paying is too much.
All right, thank you, Swan. Also, if you don't mind, mute your mic when you're not talking because you're still having that rattling noise. All right, so I appreciate that. So we've been picking on Swan a lot now, so I'll try to throw a question at Erin. She's ready for it. So earlier, or I think in your opening statement, Erin, you mentioned consequentialism and ultimately human flourishing. But I often hear theists, I've used this argument too, say that ultimately consequentialism doesn't really matter because, if everyone dies, then you're really left with nihilism. Bertrand Russell famously said that the foundations of reality reality is built on the foundation of despair. And I think Richard Dawkins paraphrasing, basically said that the universe we observe is one with no design, no purpose, no meaning, and is bitterly indifferent. So if the theist were to ask, well, why does it ultimately matter at all if we're all going to die and human extinction is inevitable? What difference does it make? So I guess we can bring up the question of nihilism now too.
Certainly true. We're all going to die. May as well have a good time before we do. And if you aren't completely self-centered, that good time should be extended not just to you, but to other people. And I would say that philosophy is important, but, well, you know my position. I think practicality is more important than philosophy. So if someone slaps me, I know it hurts and it's not good, regardless of the philosophy behind it. And again, just to bring it back into the practical, I would like to throw out a certain example. So, natural law. I am presuming that Swan is against homosexuality, but that is just a presumption. But under natural law, homosexuality is seen as immoral. However, homosexuality is observed in many different animal species, so by that definition, it is natural. It also, even though it doesn't lead to reproduction is not the be-all and end-all. It leads to other forms of human flourishing like love, happiness, contentment. And it's a victimless crime. So again, going back to the harm principle, things like, say, rape are wrong because there is a clear victim. Someone is harmed. With homosexuality, which a lot of theists consider to be immoral, unless it's rape or some other standard which we hold to all sexual acts, it's completely victimless. No one gets harmed. And why would that be considered immoral under natural law?
Okay, so Erin's question was about natural law, and first, Swan, I'll let you address her response to the nihilism question, and then you can get into natural law, because I think what Erin's saying could apply to almost any sexual ethics that isn't rape, right? I'm assuming she would agree with that. Like anything from premarital sex, masturbation, etc., is a victimless crime in that sense. So I guess Swan can have a chance to respond to both of those points that Erin brought up.
Yeah, okay. So I don't totally remember actually the first point about avoiding nihilism. So I apologize for that. And also, because homosexuality and sexual ethics is such a controversial area, that's what really got my attention. To pay attention, right, and to formulate my response carefully. So if I missed the first thing, I apologize. And Aaron, I'd love to hear maybe you re-articulate it, right? Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to natural law theory's position on homosexuality, I think it's important to point out that natural law theorists aren't merely consequentialists. And I don't think consequentialism in and of itself is a stable system. And I even think the harm principle presupposes way too many things and that it needs to be curtailed and carefully fine-tuned. Um, and, I forgot who, but, Robert George at Princeton University, one of his students actually argued that Mill needs Aristotle in order to make sense of the harm principle because it's inherently teleological and presupposes an idea of harm. So I'm just going to say there that, yeah, I mean, we can be practical, right? But then how practical do you want to be? Do you want to turn morality into just a subset of economics, and then people will become units of material value? That's just one thing to keep in mind. So then you need philosophy to come in, and that's why I said philosophy is inevitable. So then just because something is quote unquote natural, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be moral under natural law theory, because natural law theory is presupposing that the natural world is teleologically and rationally structured. So then, when we examine an act like homosexuality, the natural law theorists would say something like, well, what are the sexual organs intrinsically ordered towards? What makes sense of their functions? And what makes it intelligible? So if I'm going to use a faculty, then I better use it towards its end, its proper end, and what makes sense of it. Because if I decide, well, I can I can perform an action that denies my faculty's teleological construction, and in some sense, I am denying my humanity in performing the action itself. I'm denying the very rational structure of nature. And that in itself ends up collapsing the entire system of natural law morality. So then there's a deeper question here about if natural law theory is actually true, right? And I think when it comes to the issue, for instance, homosexuality in particular, I'll put in an anecdote, right? So so natural law theory is going to say that such persons are pursuing the good of friendship, and they are having valid emotions about wanting to be loved and to be received and to experience this physical good. But what the faculty is ordered towards is what the faculty is ordered towards, properly ordered towards, including the elements of our emotions and our heart, is a comprehensive union of both the body and the intellect or the soul or the human person, right? So then I would say that, even the Catholic Church, to bring them in, right, even or just natural law teaching in general, natural law would say that there's two things that are distinct about the Sex Act, right? One is that it's ordered towards procreation, but it's also ordered towards unity, right? And that unity is ordered towards the love of human life, because oftentimes, I've seen people who believe in sex without having to go through procreation or aim towards procreation. They'll say that kids are just burdens, or kids get in the way of romantic love, right? And that ends up subjugating a child to just a burden and something that stands in the way of human pleasure, right? So I think there's some dangers there. But anyway, just to close with this anecdote, I remember one time I prayed, God, if I'm going to believe that this is what the natural law says, that this is what the church teaches, or what you have taught in Scripture, then God, make me celibate. If I'm gonna make this rule for everybody else, then I gotta follow it too, right? I want to engage and have solidarity with these individuals, even though I'm heterosexual, and that's why I'm planning on becoming a Dominican priest, because I want to give my life to the community and I want to live out the principles that I espouse. So I want to show other people that celibacy is possible and God really is the greatest good. And yeah, I'm missing out on marriage, but I'm missing out on the goodness of the Sex Act or whatever. But got too specific there. But I think that God can complete us and make us happy. So I'm living out my philosophy and giving it that practical.
Okay, thank you. James, do you have anything to say for what either of them have commented so far? You're on mute, James. You just muted yourself, James.
Wonderful. No, I don't have any. Oh, I've actually got about 100 questions, but I think I'd say it's been a really fruitful conversation, and yeah, it's definitely certainly caused me to think. Actually, I would ask you both one question. Actually, Aaron actually had a question for you in this respect. Swan touched on something regarding the aversion of pain, or you could say the aversion of suffering, and he spoke of that as something being negative, um, and I would say that there's a good virtue within Christianity, that there's this embrace of suffering for the greater good. And Christians would say that this is something that Christ embodied and demonstrated. And you said you try to live a life, a Christian life, as best as you can, in some sense. Would you say that this is indeed a Christian virtue, this embrace of suffering? For example, if the world split in two when we were at war, and there was a good side and a bad side, and you were on a good side, and you decided to go to war for the sake of your people, would you say that this is a Christian virtue, or would you say that this is something that can be grounded in a practical or consequential ethic?
So let me see if I'm understanding the question, James. So
Yep.
the question is, the particular virtue that you highlighted, which is self-sacrifice for the greater good, is that a Christian virtue, or?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm asking Erin, is that a Christian? Would she see that as being a
Oh,
Christian
Aaron.
virtue,
Whoops.
or would she see that as being something that can be grounded in, say, a secular ethic or a practical ethic, or something that's embodied in consequentialism?
It is one of the things I like about Christianity, although I do think it can still be applied from a secular lens. So say if we combine the harm principle with utilitarianism, which is, the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, well, sometimes the greatest amount of happiness comes from one person subjecting themselves to harm so that a greater number do not face harm. And that's when we get
Yes.
soldiers sacrificing themselves in war. I would also add that principle can be taken too far. So, for example, a lot of the early church fathers were almost obsessed with becoming martyrs so they could be like Jesus, and like they deliberately tried to get themselves executed, and it was quite weird. But yes, everything in moderation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point, Aaron. That was a good question, James. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left or so, depending on how I'm trying to aim for an hour and a half roughly. I guess another question, going back to the sexual ethics briefly for Swan, is that a lot of atheists, some of them are moral realists, but a lot of them will just deny that moral objective moral values exist. And typically, the argument I hear in favor of objective morality is it's just intuitively obvious, right? No one lives their life as if they don't really pursue some kind of good. But when it comes to sexual ethics, I guess the question is if intuition and reason is how we're basing our morality, if it seems intuitively obvious to a lot of us that homosexuality doesn't seem obviously wrong, should that mean that intuition is not necessarily the best way to assess moral bases? If you understand what I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay. So that's good. Yeah, so I think people who have particularly advocated the position that like intuition is in itself like an evidence for moral realism, or people like against Ruth Shaper Doe and others. So, and their argument is that if this intuition that we have about just that morality is real, right? That there really is something wrong with harming other people, or there really is something wrong about betraying the trust of a friend and leaving them, incredibly worse off. Let's say, so to use like an unambiguous example. Uh, then the idea is that if we have to deny our intuition on this, then why not just collapse all of our intuitions, right? Because our intuitions are so fundamentally integrated to how we understand reality, to how we reason, that if we can't trust our intuitions here, then how can we trust them anywhere else? It's kind of like a litmus test, so to speak. And I think that's a valid way of beginning with the project of moral realism. Now, from this, you have people like John Rawls who have advocated for a thing called reflective equilibrium, which I think is the dominant way in which ethics is done today. So, what you do with reflective equilibrium is you begin with a moral intuition, you turn it into a principle, you test it in different cases, and then you see if it leads to the outcome harmonious with your intuition. And I think that there's a lot of value in using this Rawlsian method of reflective equilibrium. And I know natural law theorists like Brian Beesong, they're not going to say, oh, like, yeah, throw out your intuitions, because that's crazy. But what they will say, right, is that intuitions, they're kind of like our primordial grasp of truth. So we're going to kind of be sensitive to the truth and we'll kind of latch on to certain things. But these intuitions themselves need to be properly ordered and systematized such that intuitions aren't just willy-nilly being used to justify any position. So, for instance, I think that with the debate on on homosexuality, yeah, like I think intuitions are strong in this area. But I also think that, if people like Philippa Foot and other neo-Aristotelians follow the logical structure or the rational structure of act on an Aristotelian perspective, then they're going to have to either say, I'm going to keep my intuition or the system. But then they said that, oh, we're using the system to make sense of our intuition. So you have to make the decision, right? And I don't think it's practical to philosophically divorce yourself from what makes the project of morality make sense. And I'll leave it at that.
Could I jump in with something?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Um, the current Pope, Pope Francis, I know he's not everyone's cup of tea, but he's actually made some rather controversial decisions that drift away from natural law into consequentialism. For example, in 2016, when the Zika virus was ravaging South America and it was affecting primarily preborn children, he came out and said, for the first time in Catholic history, okay, fine, you can use contraception, even though it's against natural law, because it's for the greater good. It's so your kids don't get Zika. So I suppose my point is, even the Pope is now slightly drifting into consequentialism.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah, I
point,
mean,
Aaron.
I love Pope. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I love Pope Francis. He's my holy father, so I have to respect him. But yeah, I mean, there he wasn't speaking ex cathedra, and obviously he's found tension with other people or canon law lawyers who have pointed out that he is still bound by tradition, especially what the church has taught. So I mean, if that's just a one-off, then let it be a one-off. But then Pope Francis is very good in terms of being pro-life, and Pope Francis talked about civil unions being a permissible form of action. And what's interesting is that he said that when he gave that declaration, he was not thinking just only about same-sex couples, but he's also thinking about if a brother and a sister live together, or a brother and a brother, a sister and a sister, right? Then they also should have access to a civil union. And actually, I'm in agreement with Pope Francis that LGBT couples should be allowed to participate in society, and especially if they share property and stuff. I don't see that as being like disqualifying them for participating in the common good. But then what we say about marriage and sexuality, that's an important area. But yeah, I mean, so in my position, I try to be as compassionate as possible to same-sex couples and to people from the LGBT community. And I don't think we need to pass laws that just, you know, add more to their suffering.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was gonna bring it to you, Swamp, but I was gonna say, as a Protestant, I don't have the liability of having to care or defend everything the Pope does. So I'm sure you would have had more opinion on her point, but that's a good point. So I guess, Aaron, I'll ask you a question now. So a big part of, well, not a big part, but a major part of it is, evolutionary development in your system of morality. So my question is, when we talk about natural selection, right? When you ask what is selecting, it's selecting reproductive viability, right? Who can pass their genes on the most? Um, and it doesn't seem obvious to me that 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 necessarily equates to well-being. For example, or at least quality of life, because we could look at bacteria and fruit flies, which can reproduce extremely fast and therefore are very highly selected for, but they only live for a couple hours, or if you're a fly, maybe 30 days. In fact, when you look at countries, typically the countries that are poor and really worse off actually have very high population growth rates, and the West actually has a very low population growth rate. So I guess my question is, Aaron, if evolution is a major basis for morality and evolution is centered at reproduction, should we not follow the countries that are worse off to try to increase our population growth rate? And does that mean that well-being is not equated to reproductive fitness in that sense?
So I think I was applying the evolutionary model specifically to morality, not necessarily that everything evolution does is therefore good. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature is pretty horrendous. Um, I would also say the fact that viruses and bacteria and all that can multiply like anything, surely that's an argument against a good God. Why would he do that? But that's derailing the conversation. Um, and another thing that makes us humans, that separates us from animals, is that we have the intellect. We have managed to overcome our biology. So, yes, when we were in our primitive form, there was literally nothing to life except eat, sleep, reproduce. But now that we have developed, we have overcame that, and there's much more to life than just reproducing.
Swan, do you have any comment or response to that, or just any other topic you want to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, like I appreciate Aaron making that comment about human beings and what makes us unique. And I think that you know, if you follow that to its metaphysical roots and where that's all leading us, I think that really does point to the existence of God. Now, there is the question about the concerns dealing with, natural evil and nature being red in tooth and claw. So that's a conversation for another time. But yeah, I mean, I just think that oftentimes in our conversations on morality, we presuppose so much. And I think that if we stop and actually think about the structure of what we're proposing, I think it inevitably leads to the existence of God, or at least it appeals to principles of reality that ultimately point to the existence of God, right? And I mean, I'll just leave it at that. I think that, yeah, I mean, even like if you want to be practical with ethics, then you still need to incorporate certain philosophical and quote unquote abstract principles. And then once you examine that and go deeper and deeper and deeper, I think you'll see God's face at the bottom of the barrel.
Okay, thank you. So I'll give James a chance to ask one or two more questions, and then I think we'll move on to closing statements, or whatever you want to make of a closing statement, just summary of your arguments or whatever. So
yeah, look, I'm happy to go to closing arguments, Caleb, if you are.
yeah, if as long as they are. Do either of you prefer to go first? I don't know if Erin wants to go last because she gets the last word, and because she went second last time, or if she wants to go first this time because she went second. However y'all want to do it. Whoever wants to get the last word. There's a preference. No?
I'm happy
Okay.
to go.
Go first? Okay, well, if you want to go ahead, Aaron, you can go. You can more than welcome to go. These aren't timed, by the way, but just, I would say maybe 5 minutes or so, but just, I'm not worried about you. I'll go over time, so I think you'll be okay.
Oh, my final point's going to be quite brief, not even 5 minutes. The crux of the issue is, are we going to base our ethics on something that might be true and that not everyone believes in, like religion? Or are we going to instead base it on something which is universal, like flourishing happiness, avoiding harm, which anyone can pursue regardless of their underpinning philosophy? I would say in our globalized, multicultural, multi-faith world, the latter is simply the most practical and most common sense way to do things. I am not denying the existence of God. Like I said, I'm an agnostic. Everything Swan said could well be true, but it's simply a fact that it just doesn't apply to everyone, and our morality needs to move beyond religion in order to stay relevant. And that's all I have to say.
All right, Swan?
Yeah, so in my opening remarks, I kind of presented 4 different points. The first one was that I mentioned the importance of natural law and natural rights, and how people throughout history, when they were in the minority or not in institutions of power, they appealed to some deeper law that would one day vindicate them, that could stand against the state, stand against the forces of power. And that's why I think that it's important that we really understand what the moral law is, and we understand that reason itself also compel us, and that reason itself stands as a kind of, as Thomas Nagel put it, a universal judge, a universal third perspective. So I think that if we're going to base our morality on something universal, we could base it on things like evolution, or maybe our sentiments. But we've also seen that those sentiments can vary, and that they need to be principled on the basis of reason itself. And so I think that what's more universal than reason itself? It's something that we all do. It's something that binds and compels us. And it's something that even orders our desires and our passions and our intuitions and our empathy. So then I also want to point out then that I mentioned 2 examples about rational self-interest and the question of human equality. And the question is, if we make morality so practical, then there's this worry that, well, we could just boil it down to a field of economics. And then I've already gone into the ramifications of that. And then also, when it comes to the question of human equality, we inevitably have to get into the philosophy of what is morally relevant and significant about the human subject. And we could appeal by saying, like, we're advanced species now. We gotta be smarter than this and get over our prejudices. But I mean, the question is, you ask why, or where do you get this oughtness from? So that reason itself has to still be invoked in this court of morality. Talked about the inevitability of philosophy. So yeah, this seems abstract, but this is part of the game, so to speak. So we just got to deal with it, right? And then finally, I discussed how morality seems to be based upon principles that presuppose, or at least entail, the existence of God. So I mentioned these 5 principles. I don't think I'll go over them again, but But I just want to saying that if what I say is correct, then the question of morality cannot escape the question of existence of God. And as various other thinkers have pointed out, whether or not they're Christian or not, or if they're Christian atheists or Christian agnostics, like Don Keefe and Douglas Murray, I particularly love Murray a lot. They'll all point out that something has been lost with the loss of the transcendent. Something has been taken away from us, and that we now have to invent stories and ideas and use institutions of power to legislate our morality. But there's got to be something deeper than that. There's got to be something that is in reason itself that we can see and observe and appeal to. And I think ultimately speaking, once we do this, we arrive at the fact that the existence of God can be known, and that this God is good and loves us and wants us, and is the beautiful, is the good, is the truth itself. That's what completes human life. So we don't want to deprive ourselves of that great good.
All right. Well, thank both of our speakers for joining on the show today. Thank you, my co-host James, for helping us moderate this debate. In our discussion of morality, I think, regardless of where you stand, the audience watching this, we can all agree that it is objectively good for you all to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. I'll be the stereotypical YouTuber here. Do either of you want to give a shout out to your all's channels or writings or anything like that? I don't know what y'all have. Podcasts, anything that you want to plug in that we can put in the description?
Well, my website is erinburnettauthor.co.uk, and we can put it in the description so you know how to spell it.
Yeah.
I'm currently writing a book on autism in the church, which will hopefully be
Oh.
out in the next few months. So that's what I have to plug.
That's really interesting. Awesome. Swan, anything from you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast, Facebook, and YouTube channel. Well, where'd it go?
Oh, I didn't know you were going to share your screen. It caught me off guard.
Oh, I didn't mean to share my screen. Whoops,
Oh.
sorry.
I'm sure David
hey, we're
Russell
behind the
will fix
scenes.
that.
Here we
Yeah.
are.
Oh, cool.
Okay, yeah.
Nice.
Well, is it okay if I keep on talking?
Yes, keep on talking. I don't know what David's doing, but just keep on talking. You're good.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So yeah, so I have a Facebook page, YouTube channel, podcast called Intellectual Conservatism. I deal with these topics and others on my page. And then right now I'm trying to get a paper published on the papacy and its biblical Jewish historical roots. So that's very exciting. And aside from that, I'm very happy that I got to talk to Erin. And Erin, like I want to see your rabbit one day. That beautiful little creature. So yeah.
Only if she gets to see your cat. All right. And
Sure,
James, I
yeah.
believe you have a YouTube channel to plug in as well, right?
Oh yeah, not today, but yeah, I guess so. It's Honest Atheist. I haven't posted in some time, but I do have some fresh content coming up. And in terms of plugging, I just wanted to say if you're watching this today, and I'm sure you have your own opinions of morality and perspectives, and we would really love to hear from you and hear what you have to say. And maybe you could say which opinion you agree with the most, whether it was Swan's or Erin's from this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also want to give a shout out for next, I don't know if it's next week, but next episode we'll be having Fuzz Rana on from Reasons to Believe to discuss a lot of things about evolution, the existence of God, etc. And yeah, so we thank everyone from coming here to speak today. Thank my other co-hosts, and for our audience watching. You all have a great night, and hopefully you get to make up the decision for yourself. So thanks to everybody watching. I'm gonna hope he closes.